What's up, guys? Today we are continuing our water cooling journey, and as you could probably tell, all the hardware is now actually back out of this case, so it's in quite a different state from where we left it off last video. The reason that we're doing that is today we are installing our blocks. So we have our GPU block, we have our CPU block, we have our graphics card, we have our motherboard, and when we get everything installed and I show you guys how that is done, then we're going to put everything into the case. We're going to get our proper measurements for our custom distro block that's being made by Joe of Sanctum Sleeving. And he needs those measurements before he could get to fabricating. So I want to get this project rolling. I know you guys do too. So let's just get into it. Dude, I can't wait to get my hands on this thing. I've been waiting for so long.
That's what she said.
Did you really have to wear those glasses?
Yeah, dude, I needed a disguise too.
Jeez. Oh, dude, I got it. I got it. Just a few things to touch on before we really get rolling. Obviously, all the hardware is out of the case right now, and one of the reasons that we had to do that was because I made a few changes to the case itself. The first one is that we're going to be using a vertical GPU mount, so I actually had to mount Fractal's vertical GPU mounting solution into the case, and it comes with its own riser card, so that's pretty convenient. One of the reasons I wanted to do it this way is because when you have a water-cooled GPU, you don't necessarily have to worry about air circulation around the card itself, which is something that you do have to worry about when you have something like a recirculating cooler, like our Duke 2080 Ti has here. When you have a single GPU in a water-cooled build, because the water blocks are fairly narrow, sometimes they could kind of tend to get lost. With an SLI setup, it's not really that way. You have both GPUs and the bridge connecting them, so there's a lot more visually going on. But when you have a single GPU in a system like this in a fairly large case, it can get lost in the shuffle of everything else that's going on. So in order to prevent that, we're going to be using the vertical mount. It's going to better show off our block anyway, and I think it's going to look pretty cool. The second thing I did, which I guess is fairly minor, is removed the front piece of the power supply shroud. This is necessary to allow us the proper room to install 360mm radiators up front, as well as a distro plate that's going to cover the entire back wall. But before we do anything else, we got to get these blocks onto this hardware. So let's do that right now. We're going to start with the CPU block. I'm going to talk a little bit about orientation and flow, and then we'll get to the GPU block, which is obviously a little more complicated. So we've got all our hardware laid out here that we need to install the CPU block. We've got our iFixit toolkit, which comes in super handy when doing these kinds of installs because you never know what kind of screws you're going to be running up against. So let's get everything out of the box first, and then we'll jump back into this and talk about the install itself. All right, so here is our block. Nice and shiny and new and RGB enabled. Ooh. So we're not actually going to be installing this over a CPU right now because this is mainly for measurements and fitting. So I'm not going to remove this please remove before use sticker because we'll do that right before we actually do the final build. So there's not a whole heck of a lot to mounting a CPU water block, especially onto a mainstream Intel socket. It's actually fairly straightforward. It mounts like almost any other AIO cooler would. Now, obviously they're all different, but the mounting mechanisms are not overly complicated. What you really want to worry about when you're mounting a block like this is flow. Now, EK blocks have an inlet and an outlet, and they're actually labeled on the block itself. They used to say in and out. Now there's like arrows, a down arrow and an up arrow indicating in and out. And one of the reasons that you want to make sure that you pay attention to that is that the microfins inside and the jet plate are oriented such that the flow can go in either direction, but it is much more restricted if it goes in one direction versus the other. When it comes down into the jet plate, it actually will go through basically a slot and hit the fins, and the pressure of it being forced through the slot will shoot it out through the fins, and then it will progress through the block and then come out the outlet, which is actually has very little blockage to it at all. If it goes into the outlet and then tries to progress through the block and come back up through the jet plate almost acts as a blockage, and it will restrict your flow. It actually affects temperature significantly. You could see, 5, 6, 7 degree difference very easily just by reversing the flow on your block. Now, EK blocks for Intel sockets are made in a square pattern, just the same as the holes here on the motherboard. So that means that you can mount it in any way that you want. Just make sure that when you're mounting it, you're directing the flow into the proper inlet, and you shouldn't have any problems. Now, because we're going to be using a distro plate into the case, it's likely that all of the flow is going to be going to the right of the motherboard. If I have this here, this is going to be the distro plate. So all the tubing is going to be running in this direction. So it's going to be a lot easier, instead of having things like this, so that the tubes are running parallel to each other and on top of each other, essentially, is if I have it rotated like this, so that you have the inlet here and the outlet here, and then tubing can go wherever it needs to go, but the tubes are gonna run next to each other, as opposed to me having to worry about different heights to run them on top of each other. So that's really what I have to worry about here, and one of the reasons that I need to get this installed is so I could tell Joe exactly what the heights are on the distro block for the tubing to be running to. So let's get this installed, and then we'll move on to our GPU. So I actually decided to just install the CPU. I figured, why not? It's not doing anything else, and it's just gonna be easier later on down the road. So yes, we are installing the CPU in here before the block goes on. So here is our CPU block all installed, and as we discussed, you could see that I have rotated it so that we can easily run the tubes parallel out. I've also tucked away the RGB header, tucked it underneath one of these feet, so that it neatly comes out the top here and it's not gonna, flop around and be messy. So we're all set. This should be our final setup for when we actually do the build. Shouldn't need to take this off at all. So now we're gonna, guess these need to be tightened a little bit, huh? So now this is going to be set aside, and we're gonna work on our GPU. GPU blocks are always a little more challenging because every cooler is attached differently, every block is attached differently, and sometimes you never really know how these things are gonna come apart and what screwdrivers you might need and whatever else. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna time lapse this because I don't know what I'm gonna encounter, and you guys will kind of come along with me on my journey of discovery. And when we're all said and done, I'll talk a little. Hey, I found a washer. That can't be good. I'm gonna go journey discovery where this thing came from, and then we'll get to this. Success! We have got our cooler off here, and this one had a few tricks up its sleeve. This little plate here I actually thought was just attached to the cooler itself, but it turns out it was underneath of this little cover were additional screws. So I was kind of confused as far as why it wasn't coming apart, but I guess that's why. But you could see the large Turing die right here, which we're gonna clean off in a second. And here is the MSI Duke cooler, which is fairly substantial looking, to be honest. Has a really generous fin stack here with heat pipes running through. This card actually ran really well for me, especially when doing like the XOC stuff. But here is our PCB, and this is what we're worried about. I'm gonna clean up these screws around here, clean up this die just a little bit, and then we gotta get this thing off, and then we'll get to installing. So here is our naked PCB with the die exposed. You can see it's all shiny. There is a little bit of residual thermal paste around the die inside of this little package area. That's okay. Thermal compound is not conductive, and if you really try to get into those little grooves and try to remove this thermal paste, say with a Q-tip or any other way of cleaning it, you run the risk of potentially disturbing one of these SMDs or surface mounted devices, which is installed onto the package and is critical to the functioning of the card. it's best to just leave it, clean it off as best you can with something soft, and whatever is left in the little grooves, it's fine. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with what a GPU PCB looks like, this is it. The GPU die itself is going to be pretty obvious. It's the big thing right in the middle. You have the memory modules surrounding it. So in this case, we have 11 gigs of GDDR6. So each one of these is 1 gig. Then there's 11 of them. Obviously, one of them is missing. They need to be close to the die so that there is low latency communication between the two. So what we need to do is we need to cut these to size. We need to get them installed, and then we could start screwing down our block. So our block is installed, and I don't know if you guys could have told by the time lapse, but I was having a crazy hard time finding the appropriate screws to go and attach the back plate, and I still couldn't find all of them that would work. I literally went through every single screw that was the appropriate length that EK provided, and nothing worked in this hole except for this screw, and then nothing worked in this hole except this screw. I don't understand. I don't understand. This is not my first time doing this, and it just seems to be really weird that for some reason I didn't have the appropriate screws to attach this properly. I'm not sure what's going on here. Maybe I'll try to find another screw that'll fit this hole. But to be honest, like, it's fine. It's not going to cause any issues at all. We're making thermal contact between the back plate and the back of the PCB, so that's not going to be affected. And then the front is attached without any issues. I didn't have any problems screwing this in, so no issues here. And let's just get this installed in the case. All right, guys, we ended up going a little bit further than I had anticipated, so I'm just going to try to wrap this up really quickly. Let me show you what I've been doing. So here is the build as we have left it. Now, originally I just planned on installing the motherboard and the GPU and kind of seeing what I could get out of it from there, because as you see, this is going to be a custom distro block. And we're doing a couple other custom things in here, but I needed to get the spacing for the inlet and outlet holes for all of our various components. So in order to do that, I needed to install the radiators and fans as well to make sure that the spacing works. So that's what we did. We got our 360 up top, we got our 360 up front, and these are all EK parts. So thank you very much to EK for sponsoring this build. And I'm sure you'll see a lot more of them as we go forward and do some more here. Obviously all the fittings are EK as well. But this is where we're gonna leave this. And pretty happy with the progress I made today, because I honestly didn't expect to get this far. I mean, this was not the plan. But I'm kind of glad that we did, because I actually spent a little time on the phone with Joe, the guy who is doing this for us. And we went over a lot of information as far as how that was gonna be made. and what it was gonna look like when it was done. So hopefully all the measurements are gonna be accurate, I guess, the best I could do, so that the tubing runs are perfectly parallel and they go horizontal across like that. So that's it, guys. Thanks for watching the video, and this build is coming along nicely. It's probably going to be a little while before we have another update because this is going to take a couple weeks to manufacture. So when this comes back, you will see another video, and we'll get to work finishing this project up and getting some final benchmark numbers for you. So thanks for watching, guys. Get subscribed, check out the merchandise store and all that stuff, and I will see you next time.